Good evening, everyone. Do come and have a seat if you'd like one. I'm going to start very briefly by saying three things. So just to say that I am a partner here. My name is Damien Burnhill. And I'm going to say three things. The first is welcome. It's lovely to have you here, and it's a privilege to be hosting this event. Second thing is that as a firm, we've enjoyed working with PAS over a number of years. There are currently 20 volunteers in the firm. They have a fantastic opportunity to assist with the work of PAS, and we're very grateful as a firm for that opportunity. And the third thing is to introduce Kate Lill, who will kick us off with our first bit of women prisoner topic on the family something project.
Family law project.
Family law project, but you're going to know a lot more about it, and I'm going to know a lot more about it by the time Kate's finished.
Thanks very much. Please bear with me tonight because I'm on maternity leave at the moment and my brain is not working properly. So if I make any mistakes, then that is my excuse. And my notes are written by hand because our printer is in the shed, so I had to do it the old-fashioned way. With an estimated 17,000 children a year experiencing their mother going to prison, many women find themselves in custody with children left in the community without any access to legal advice about their rights relating to their children. From my experience, a lot of women are advised that they will receive non-custodial sentences and therefore don't expect this to happen and have no idea of where to turn for help. Legal aid for family law matters is very limited, much like other areas of social justice. And many mothers don't realise the benefit of seeking legal advice because when they enter prison, they think they lose parental responsibility for their children. In the absence of a free family law provision in prison, 3 years ago, PAS, alongside the Rights of Women and Lancaster University, began a pilot project to deliver this desperately needed service. So Halley Stewart Trust and the Waits Foundation generously funded this project. Rights of Women, who specialise in family law, trained 2 PAS caseworkers, myself and Deborah, who is unfortunately no longer working with PAS, trained us to deliver family law advice at clinics similar to the prison law ones we do daily. The project was initially to focus on assisting women who are at risk of losing their children to adoption. However, as legal aid is often available in these cases, we found that advice is more greatly needed for women where this is not the case. For example, where a mother wants contact with a child who is living with a family member under private or informal arrangements. Lancaster University have evaluated the project for us and produced a report which is available tonight. It's at the back of the room. Whilst the report provides a good insight into the issues that women face, it only covers 10 months of the project. And from my experience on the ground, it shows that the situation is much more serious than the report describes, and that there is a wider opportunity for PAS to help women if we have the ability and capabilities to do so. Women in prison have complicated family law issues. They're not simple like often prison law issues can be. All cases have the added complications from the start with the practical difficulties of being in prison. This includes not being able to speak to professionals involved with their children, such as the child's social worker, being able to attend hearings because a production order hasn't been made, being able to put arrangements in place to have contact. For example, just arranging a telephone call is much more complicated from prison, and the inevitable risk assessments that are often present in cases. They are also complicated by the disconnect between the family and criminal courts, and the family courts not understanding the practicalities of prison daily life. Many women are also seeking advice on difficult legal issues where the law is arguably unclear, and you could not reasonably expect any layperson to be able to navigate the system, let alone a woman who is currently inside. This project has meant that women in these situations have had access to free legal advice and assistance, with many of them having positive outcomes that they may not have been possible without PAS's help. As part of the project, we've also published 4 guides in conjunction with Rights of Women on family law issues. And actually a shout out should go to Olive because she did a lot more work than I did on those. We have 4 guides, one on parental responsibility, one on when families cannot agree, one on when social services are involved, and one on adoption. And these are the only guides of their kind which have been written specifically for women in prison on family law issues with the help of women in prison. Their lived experience has given them the insight to help us produce informative guides that are accessible and useful to women in those situations. Although they provide information on difficult emotional topics that are hard to deal with, we have found that having the information is part of dealing with the issue itself. As we all know, getting information in prison is difficult, so these guides are a really needed resource for women. Even if all they do is provide some comfort to a woman that she is not alone and going through this by herself. One woman who took part in our focus groups on the family law guides actually said it's important that a woman reading this doesn't think that she's the only person that this has happened to. Whilst, in my view, the project has been a great success, meeting the needs of many women who would otherwise have nowhere to turn, we've barely scratched the surface. We're currently running clinics in 3 female prisons, but there is an extensive need across the whole female estate that isn't being met. The topic of tonight's lecture actually illustrates the importance and need for the service. I'm currently on maternity leave, but the intention is to expand the service when I'm back, hopefully, if we can secure funding to do so. PAS would like to thank the Sir Halley Stewart Trust and Waits Foundation for their generosity and ongoing support throughout the project, and Rights of Women and Lancaster University for their help too. And Mayor Brown also designed and printed the family law guides for us, so we thank them too. We'd also like to thank Fiona McTaggart, who has made it possible for the clinics to continue whilst I'm on maternity leave, now that the project is over. And I personally would like to thank Olive from Rights of Women, who, without her help, I wouldn't be able to have actually got through the project and delivered the service that I have. So thank you very much.
Hello, good evening. First of all, can I say to all of you, thank you for being here. I know that some of you are in the business, as it were, but there's a lot going on. We live in turbulent times, and prisoners are generally a pretty low down on most people's agenda, including the news desk at The Guardian sometimes as well, but there you go, that's another matter. So it's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker tonight. I first met Edwina quite a long time ago, about 9 or 10 years ago, when we were on a committee. And I remember I have a couple of very clear memories. We were at this round table and we were sat next to each other, and I heard her speak on matters, and then I spoke about things. And I was left with 2 impressions of her, that A, she knew her stuff, and B, that she cared about things. And I've met quite a lot of people who work, I don't know, with prisoners or in other walks of life, and this is not meant to be critical of them, but I think they could move jobs, you know, the next day. You know, they're perfectly good at what they do, you know, but it's not all that often you meet people and you think, you know, that person cares. So the other thing I remember is that there was a chief constable there who looked about 20, and I felt about 90 anyway, but there you go. So anyway, and in the years since that first meeting, my initial views on Edwina's knowledge of the system and her passion has been cemented even more firmly, you know. And I'm sure that most of you here will know now, and I'm not going to chronicle it, you know, but how truly appalling the state of the prison system is at this minute. It's the worst since I've ever known it, and I go back to 1957. I go back to staff wearing National Front badges, where beatings by staff were commonplace, and it's far, far worse now than ever I've known it, but I'm sure you know that. Twice in my lifetime, I've harboured strong hopes about seeing a decent and humane prison system in this country. The first one followed the Strangeways riot, and then the subsequent Wolf inquiry and the Wolf report. And indeed, after that report, the conditions changed dramatically for the better in prisons. And I thought, bosh, we're on the road here now, you know. And then we had Michael Howard and Anne Widdecombe. And just in case perish the thought of political bias, I put Jack Straw and David Blunkett in with that unholy quartet. So, you know, the party political things aside, you know. And while I'm here, can I say something about Paz very quickly? Because I wasn't involved in the Strangeways riot, but I got involved in the aftermath. I was outside and I badgered my way onto the inquiry. And I met Lord Justice Wolf, and I formed a great respect for him. And it was the first time that I've ever respected a judge, you know. And I think that with Paz, because most prisoners, they see the law solely as an instrument of punishment. But through Paz, and I've seen it time and time and time again, they can see that the law can work for them. And who knows what that means to people in the long run. And the second time my hopes were raised, again followed an appalling chronicle of events in the early part of this century when the deaths of women in prison just soared beyond measure. And in fact, there were 6 deaths in 1 year in one prison style. And I remember dearly Pauline Campbell, who fought so hard to raise the public awareness of the conditions in the female estate. And then we had the Causton report, and that again engendered real hope because things did change. I went to Style, and I'm not picking on Style. Those 6 deaths could have happened in any women's prison at the time because it was so rife everywhere. But I went back to Style a year later, and the place was transformed. And I thought, you know, so here we are now, and it's in a pretty bad state. And what we need, I think, is another Harry Wolf or Jean Causton. So no pressure then, Edwina, if you will. Okay.
Thank you very much. So for the past 2 decades, I have been working in and around the prison system. I started at the age of 18 and I've just turned 38. And it is sad to reflect on the fact that we now sort of live in a time where the prison system has never been more dangerous, the violence has never been higher, the self-harm has never been higher, and the bad's kind of really gone through the roof and the good has sort of disappeared a little bit. But within all of that, there is pockets of extraordinary work, there's pockets of, you know, there's the amount of brilliant people I meet in the prison system day in, day out, when people say, what keeps you going? It's some of the prisoners I meet, a lot of the prison officers I meet are exceptionally brilliant people, organisations like Paz. So there's a lot to be sort of positive about, but much work to do. But of course, it's not a vote winner, is it? So the first time I came across families in prisons was when I was 18. I was in Central Jail in Kathmandu in Nepal by myself. I was sort of on my gap year, going off to find myself. And it was really odd because I walked into that prison, aged 18, and I left. And I always say that I left physically, but I never left prisons emotionally or mentally. it was the women's side of Central Jail. There was the male side and the female side, and in the female side you had the women were sort of washing each other's hair. There were children scrabbling around, they were flying kites. It was sort of quite a domestic scene. And then I went round to the men's side of the prison, and I wasn't allowed in, and I didn't want to go in. And there was a big Western man standing at the gates, and a little Nepalese boy sort of by his feet, who must have been about 4 years old. And I said to the interpreter, "What's he in for?" And she said, "Oh, he's a paedophile." And I said, "Well, what's that 4-year-old boy doing down by his ankles?" And she was like, "Yeah, well, you know, the children get locked up with the parents." You know, and I was 18, so that was my sort of introduction to it. You know, it is a third world country, so there's sort of, you know, there's different challenges over there compared to here. But I left that day sort of changed. Maybe I did find myself, I wasn't planning to, but it had a huge impact on me. I then went to university. I studied at Northumbria University, and I did criminology and sociology, and I actually wrote my dissertation on children being reared in prisons. And it was an East versus West study, mainly because I thought whoever's marking my dissertation wouldn't know anything about the Nepalese prison system, so I kind of thought I was in for a bit of a easy mark. It didn't work out that well. But, you know, so then I started learning about the mother and baby units that we have in our country, in our sort of women's prison system, and learnt about the attachment theory and the work of Balby, and how women, and I don't know if it has changed today, I don't think it has, but if a woman, this was 18 years ago, if a woman was serving time, if she was in for a long sentence, the baby would be removed at 18 months, and if she was serving a shorter sentence, the baby would be removed at 6 months. And then the sort of rationale behind that was something to do with, well, actually, if it's only 6 months, the baby won't have that much time to bond with the mother. Well, having had 3 children myself, every time one of my babies got to 6 months, I literally felt my heart break, because my mind would immediately go back to what I'd learned at university, and then it all started becoming very real. You know, my children now are sort of 4, 5, and 8, and I think that's why this sort of particular area just sort of grips me, and probably grips quite a lot of you in this room, because it's emotional and it sort of feels personal. After my dissertation, I, funnily enough, ended up working in Style Prison, which is talked about a lot, because it was known as the cutting house back then, because of the levels of self-harm and the levels of suicide. I grew up in Chester, so Wilmslow in Manchester was kind of, you know, down the road-ish. So I started working there, and I looked into becoming a prison officer and everything, and my parents were like, where did it all go so weird? And actually, it was the governor of Brixton Prison at the time who I knew said, don't become an officer, Edwina. You could be much more help kind of working in and around and doing other things. But I so desperately wanted that frontline operational experience. From a young age, I wanted to spend more time with prisoners. I didn't want to just be with the staff. I didn't want to be in the boardrooms, and I didn't want to be in the sort of what I sort of deemed the boring places when I was in my early 20s. So I did start working in Style, and I remember thinking, oh my God, there's been some horrible mistake. The government can't possibly know what's going on in here. And I think it's my job to go and tell them, because if they knew what was going on in here, they wouldn't organise things like this. You know, I could see this at the age of 21. So I then sort of set about sort of thinking, you know, how do I get to the movers and shakers, and how do I tell them that they've got it all so wrong? And I did end up working in the House of Lords when I was 25, and it was a horrible shock to find out that they did know what was going on, and they didn't have much energy to do much about it, even though women and men, of course, were dying. So that's just a bit about sort of me and my background there. But before I go on to talk about sort of the families and children being separated from mothers, I think it's important. I know that a lot of you in this room will have the stats well rehearsed, but I think it's always important to lay a few of them out and to sort of put it into context, because even though I give a lot of speeches and I rattle these stats off again and again, as I was sort of reading it back on the train, I never ceased to be appalled and shocked at these statistics. So there's 12 women's prisons in this country, as many of you will know, 2 private, the 10 are public. The prison population always hovers around 87,000, and women make up 4,000 of that, men make up 81,000. So I think that's the first stat that really sort of hits you in the face when it comes to the difference between women being in prison and why, and men being in prison and why. It's a huge, huge difference. Over 80% are in for non-violent crimes. So it sort of makes you wonder whether this is a really good use of taxpayers' money and time and effort. Most women are in for sort of things like acquisitive crimes, drugs, fraud, motoring offences, of course, the council tax issue, the TV licence, non-payment of TV licence issue that still happens today. 70% of women serving 6 months or less, which is a big statistic. 38% of women do not have accommodation to go to on release. And actually, down in my neck of the woods, I'm from Hampshire, Portsmouth, City Council said they used to see, there's been a huge rise of female homelessness down in Portsmouth, and they used to see, they'd say maybe 1 woman a month sort of coming out of prison on their street. They're now up to 2 a week. So there's been a huge increase in that. Nearly half of all women in prison have reported attempting suicide in their lifetime. That's something we sort of don't manage to sort of deal with hugely well. This is an amazing one. Many women remanded into custody don't go on to receive a custodial sentence. And this is where it gets really bananas. So yes, this stat is from 2016, because it's the only sort of the most recent one I could find, actually. But in 2016, 60% of women remanded by the magistrates' court didn't receive a custodial sentence. And that statistic is 41% from the Crown Court. So, of course, what happens when a woman goes into prison? She loses her home, her job, her children get taken into care. We know pretty much generally where children go when they're taken into care. They sort of tend to sort of graduate up to sort of Feltham. That is sort of commonly known. With fewer than 1% of all children in England are actually in care, but around 40% of children in the secure training centres and young offenders institutes have been in care. You know, so I'm really bad at maths, don't get me wrong, but even I can see that this is absolutely ludicrous. 79% reported that they had mental health issues, so it also brings up the sort of question about the officers and the difficult job that they have. Are they mental health nurses? Are they family practitioners? You know, what are we expecting from them? The rates of self-harm amongst women are at the highest level for 8 years. Another stark difference between the men and the women. Generally speaking, women tend to internalise their violence. It's very much sort of, you know, beating ourselves up about things. So the self-harm tends to be more prevalent in the women. Generally speaking, men tend to externalise the violence. So there will be a sort of, you know, lashing out that goes on. But sadly, the self-harm rates now are increasing hugely in the male estate as well. An estimated 312,000 children annually lose a parent to imprisonment in England and Wales. And all these stats, you know, I'm sure you know, but they'll be the tip of the iceberg, because data collation is not, I wouldn't say, the Ministry of Justice's strong point. 17,000 of those children are separated from their mothers, who is often the primary carer. And only 9% of children whose mothers are in prison are cared for by their father in their mother's absence. So that's really crucial as well, because whenever you're talking on this topic, people will say to me, and I'm really irritated, you know, men have children as well. Men, you know, are dads. I'm like, yes, I do know that. But I also know that we have to work with the research that has been done. We have to work with the data that we have, which, yes, is sketchy at best, but we've got some of it. And we know what the differences are. So we know what direction we need to be moving in, and there's no room for defensiveness about that. So the statistic about 1% of all children in England, fewer than 1% of all children in England who are in care, I think we sort of need to hold on to that statistic, reminding ourselves that 40% of children in prison have come from the care system. Because I think we really need to keep in our minds the impact of bad sentencing when it comes to babies and toddlers and teenagers, because they are the innocent victims, they are the families, and the families are very rarely talked about. It's the victim that's talked about, but it's not the sort of family unit that gets completely decimated when someone does go to prison. So I'm going to talk about my great friend, Dr. Shona Minson, who many of you will have heard of, and quite frankly, she should be standing here giving this lecture, but I'm going to talk about her work, because as much as we can talk about everything that's bad and doom and gloom, and I'm wearing sort of all black, and I apologise for that because I'm usually wearing something really bright, but there's loads of really good things going on, and Dr. Shona Minson and her work is a real example of that, and I don't want you all leaving sort of thinking nothing can be done, because impact is being made and people are listening. It just takes a very long time. So Shona Minson, she did her PhD research. She's from Oxford University. That's where she did her PhD. And her research was into the maternal impact of imprisonment on the child. And she said to me when I sort of first messaged, she was like, well, it's really exciting because it's the biggest research piece that's ever been done on this subject. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And she went, not really, no one else has done one. So it was like the first time that anybody had ever looked at this. And I sort of thought, again, I sort of keep, getting shocked by things. And I sort of think at some point I will be unshockable, but I sort of keep being shocked. Anyway, so for the last couple of years, that's what Shona's been doing. And her work examined whether the impact on children is considered when a mother is sentenced in the criminal courts in England and Wales. And I was sort of sat there going, well, of course it's considered. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't spend that much time in court, but I was like, well, of course it would be considered, because, when children are removed from parents in divorce proceedings, this is... Anyway, I was like, she's from Oxford, she clearly knows what she's talking about. And whether the rights of the children under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child are upheld. And again, I thought, well, you can't really get around that. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, surely they've got this covered. So she interviewed children with mothers in prison, people who cared for children of the imprisoned mother, so grandparents, friends, aunts, uncles, whoever it was. They were all interviewed about their experiences, and also Crown Court judges were interviewed about their practice when sentencing mothers of dependent children. And Shona found that children of women sentenced in the criminal courts are treated without the concern given to children separated from their parents in the family courts, where the child's well-being is the paramount consideration of the court, quite rightly. And it was very interesting sort of watching her. I was at the launch of her research, and again, a lot of defensiveness. No, she's got it all wrong. And it was very odd, because this woman was standing there. She'd been working on it for about 4 years. She'd interviewed so many people, but still the denial was there in some quarters, which was pretty alarming, to be honest with you. Judges and magistrates are inconsistent, she found, in how they consider dependent children, and often do not understand how the children are affected when their primary carer is sentenced. And of course, this doesn't go for all judges, it doesn't go for all magistrates. But again, whenever that defensiveness comes up, I sort of say, well, it's really great that you're doing it well and that you know about it, but what about the areas in the country, we need to raise our game nationally. Not just, oh, it's all going so well in Basingstoke or wherever, so therefore that's fine. We don't need to worry about the rest of the country. So Shona, during her work, worked with a range of partners, the Judicial College, the Magistrates Association, HMPPS, of course, the Criminal Bar Association, the Law Society, the Prison Reform Trust, and Frank's Films. Because actually what she did, she created a couple of films for sentences. There were 4 films which share children's and carers' experiences and explains the court's duties towards the children. They target different audiences, so the 4 films, one for the sentences and then one for sentencing authorities, also a film for probation staff, solicitors and barristers, and mothers at risk of imprisonment, because often it's those people, when they're going into court, they need to be sort of educated about actually what might happen. Because often women will go to court, and you'll know this sort of better than most, they'll go to court and they'll be too scared to say they've got children. So there's all sorts of things that go on, but sort of behind the scenes, that the sentencers need to be aware of, and the women themselves need to be aware of. But of course, the probation system and the whole structure around, in order to protect that or those innocent children, that has to be really watertight. So the impacts of her work, the impact of those videos and the work that she's done have actually been huge. So it gets more positive. Just a quote from Shona where she says, "There have been cases already where the judge was referred to the case law and the evidence presented in the films and subsequently decided that the child's well-being meant an immediate custodial sentence for the mother was inappropriate or should be for the shortest time possible." So some of the impacts. The work led to changes in guidance from the National Probation Service on pre-sentence reports. Most of us all know what pre-sentence reports are, but those of you who don't, they're the report that gets given to the magistrate to sort of say, to give the background on the individual that's about to be sentenced so the magistrate can get up to speed quite quickly. So that is a really crucial document. The March 2019 guidance states for the first time ever that probation officers must request an adjournment for a full PSR, pre-sentence report, in cases where the defendant has child dependents, to assess the impact on them and to ensure that plans are in place so children are cared for during imprisonment. So it's sort of quite strange that that was never really a thing before. You know, in family courts, when a child's removed, as again you'll well know, there's structures that are put in place, there's funding that goes with it, and it turns out that in criminal law, the children, there's nothing for them. So if a grandmother takes on 4 kids because the mother's gone to prison, that grandmother gets no money and no support, and it's not recognised, and there's no data collection. Unbelievable. Another impact, Shona produced a short film, as I said, made in 4 versions for different audiences, outlining the court's duty to consider the impact of a mother's prison sentence on a dependent child. The video was launched in January of 2018 and is now embedded in criminal justice training. The Judicial College, responsible for all judicial training, hosts the film on their intranet now, and the topic is now included in their sentencing seminars for Crown Court judges and recorders, which is great. But you know when you're like, it's 2019 and we're just now getting judges to realise that children matter. And somehow it's bypassed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's bypassed every, you know, and we sort of hold ourselves in such great esteem, sort of Great Britain, our great British justice system. Amazing. The film has become part of ongoing tracked training for all National Probation Service court staff in England and Wales. So the impacts have been huge. The film's content was referenced in the government's female offender strategy that was published in June of last year, which is also great, but I sometimes wonder about the sort of power of the female offender strategy. I was talking about it with some people before I started speaking, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's a sort of good document, it makes sense, all the rest of it, but you know, like all these strategies, it's like, stick it on the shelf until a group of people get together and start sort of saying, oh yeah, what about that female offender strategy that you wrote? Have you done anything about it? Usually the answer is no. Eric mentioned the Corson report that is 12 years old now, I think, and not a huge amount has happened as a result of that report either, even though the government recommended about 52 of the 53 recommendations. So following on from Dr. Minson's briefing paper and petition to the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, it launched an inquiry into the right to family life of children whose mothers are imprisoned. That was chaired by Harriet Harman. And the committee's final report was published in September of this year. And it was quite amazing. So Shona was involved in that. There was lots of different people who were involved in that. My organisation, One Small Thing, were asked to find or bring along a lady who might have been involved in the criminal justice system, so I know lots of them. And there was an amazing lady called Lena, and she had 4 children taken off her. She went to court, and you can see this, it's online. She went to court, and it was a non-violent first offence. She was a Bangladeshi British. She had been taken into an arranged marriage at a very young age in Bangladesh. Her husband brought prostitutes into the house and drug dealers and this, that, and the other. She has never been a drug addict or an alcoholic or anything like that. And she got involved in sort of his fraud because she's lovely and sweet. And he realised that his fraud would be much more successful if she was involved in it. Anyway, she did try and shop him to the police. It all went wrong. They caught up with her. They arrested her. He fled and disappeared. The lawyer said to her, don't worry about it. It's your first offence. She put her money in the meter in the car park. The 4 children were at school. And he said, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. And so nothing was sorted out. And the judge didn't ask about her children. She didn't know what was going on. She didn't talk about her children because she didn't think she was going to prison. And then they said, send her down for 4 years. And that's why I took her to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, because she is one of those people that judges say to me all the time, that doesn't happen, Edwina. Women wouldn't get sent to prison for 4 years if it was a first-time, non-violent. Clearly, the husband was running drugs from the house and operating with sort of prostitutes in the house. 4 children at school, it wouldn't happen. She'd have to have time to sort it out. Well, she didn't have time, and it happens. And it was really nice to be able to sit at the Joint Committee. I was there having to be quiet at the back, which I'm not very good at. And she was doing the talking, but sort of seeing the baronesses sitting around the table kind of going, no, surely, no, not in our country in 2019 or whenever it happened. It was in the last 10 years. So her 4 children, what happens? So she gets taken to prison. The social services, she's not told what is going to happen to the children. The children get picked up. She gets a call on her 2nd day in prison saying her children are going to be forcibly adopted. And at that point, Harriet Harman actually said, she didn't quite say, I don't believe it, but she was like, no, surely not. But there were children there who were giving evidence whose mothers had gone into prison, and they were like, yeah. And me and my colleague were like, yeah, we sort of hear it all the time. This isn't a shock to us, but it's so shocking that they didn't know. It's great that they're sort of educating themselves about it now, but you sort of think, my God, why do people not sort of listen or sort of look into these things? There's 9 floors of the Ministry of Justice. What are they doing? They were adopted out. She got them back. She got her 3 girls. So she had 3 girls and a boy. The husband's family took the boy because it was a sort of Muslim Bangladeshi family, and they wanted nothing to do with the girls and her after that. She actually, 2 of her girls stayed together, but the sibling separation, which is something I was going to talk about, it's one thing having your mother taken off you. If you're then a sibling of 2 or 3 or 4 or however many it is, if you're then wrenched apart from your siblings, think how traumatic that is. My 3 children sometimes all snuggle up together in the same bed. They've all got their own bedroom, but, they're like little puppies. They like to sort of be together. And the idea then that these children were just taken to different places, and they were put with a Sikh family. So there was nothing to do with the fact that she was Bangladeshi, and, they hadn't tried to understand. She was like, you can't put them with a Sikh family, like, it's different. And they turned up to prison to visit her, and they had nits, and they weren't being looked after properly, and there was nothing she could do. And she talks so heartbreakingly about just wanting to be able to brush her daughter's hair. I'm going to move on before I start crying. So if you're interested in the document on the report that was written by the Joint Committee on Human Rights, there's lots of recommendations. The first recommendation, which is good and bad in sort of equal measure, is, let me find it, mandatory data collection and publication of it by the Ministry of Justice. Profound. So what they mean by that, so there's a quote here from Harriet Harman, or from the report. There is a complete lack of reliable quantitative data on the number of mothers in prison. And I said there's only 12 prisons, and there's only 4,000 women in prison, right? So this isn't rocket science. There is a complete lack of reliable quantitative data on the number of mothers in prison, the number of children whose mothers are in prison, and the number of women who are pregnant and who give birth in prison. This isn't difficult. Any one of us, if we were given the job, could go around those 12 prisons and count for ourselves. Is it difficult for the governor to sort of find out in their prison of maybe 200, 300 women? So that was recommendation number 1, and after I read that, I was like, oh my God, I don't think I can read anymore. But it is interesting. For those of you who are interested in this particular subject, then I would urge you to look at it. So Dr. Minston's work provided key evidence also for the Farmer Review. The first Farmer Review was about men and dads in prison, but then he quickly realised that the primary carers were the women. So we, gently urged him that maybe it would be really good if he did one for the women as well, which he did, and that was published in June of this year. And of course, all these reports say the same thing. They have the same findings. So it's a case of sort of, the action needing to take place. And of course, who's better placed to do that than lawyers, solicitors, barristers? Shona was a barrister and she was called to the bar. I always get confused as to barristers and solicitors and lawyers, so I apologise. But she was doing that kind of work. So it's really important. I don't understand why there's never any give on the sentencing guidelines. Who are the gatekeepers? Cross-departmental, cross departments in government, cross-party consensus with a lot of these things. So if we have so much sort of synergy in our thought processes, even with governments of different colours, why is it that we can't even change some of the most basic sentencing guidelines? So finally, I think, 'cause we might do questions and answers, finally, on Shona's work, a judge had to say this: the research papers and the film that Shona has provided have been enormously helpful to judges. She has demonstrated to us in very stark terms the real implications for children if their primary carer goes into custody. And that was from a judge in Harrow Crown Court. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much. So very happy to take any questions as long as they're not sentencing related, because I'll have to find someone else in the audience to answer those. No? Yeah.
In relation to Shona's work, I know quite a lot about it. She actually worked on the report for the Family Project as well.
Right.
It's wonderful that it's now sort of disseminated and taught by the Judicial College and things like that. But is there anything in place to ensure that solicitors and barristers are trained in this area? Because sometimes it's the legal representative who actually doesn't know the law properly and isn't the one who is putting their client's case forward as they should be.
Yeah, well, I saw Shona last week actually at another conference we were both at, and she was obviously talking about her work. And, we're meeting up in the new year because her plan is to try and get this obviously as wide as possible. She pretty much, to try and do research at university, she really struggled to get anyone to give her the money to do it because no one was really that interested, didn't think it was that important. So I think for her, she would do as much as she possibly could if only she would sort of get the funding. But I know she's got big plans and she's not going to let it go. So I'll mention it to her when I see her next year. Anybody else? Yes.
I'm not a lawyer. But
Oh, good.
I was thinking about the legal aid and the fact that it's very difficult to get it. And the effect when you mentioned about this poor mother who was told by her lawyer that, no need to worry. And then I think you said she got 3 of the children back.
She got 3 of the children back, yeah.
But it seems to me that if the legal aid must be having a terrible effect on these type of families as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's very difficult for them to appeal.
Yeah.
To get the right advice in the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of wonder, when legal aid was sort of taken away by sort of Chris Grayling, you wonder whether there was a reason for that. Is it actually more, I don't know, is it easier for them if these people can't fight for themselves and you have to be wealthy to access justice? And that is not what the great British justice system that so many countries in this world look to us and our system. And I sort of think, my God, really? Because like all these things, when you sort of get under the skin of it, you're like, I just cannot. And I think sometimes that's why a lot of these atrocities are sort of perpetuated, because people just, like, no, surely not. I was in a prison the other day and I said to someone, oh yeah, there was just this young guy walking down the wing and there was an apple core and he just picked up the apple core and sort of started eating it off the floor. And, it's sort of so Dickensian, the whole thing, but I think it's so difficult for people outside of the system to really understand what it is, because it's unbelievable. You know, it's probably like things that go on in the NHS that I don't know anything about because I'm not a doctor. And when some of my doctor friends sort of tell me about what goes on, I'm like, surely not. You know, come on. You know, and it's amazing that these things go unchecked. And as I say, when you've got 9 floors of the Ministry of Justice, you've got a women's team, they're all nice people. They sort of pretty much put the female offender strategy together. You know, all of us in this room would probably agree with what was in the female offender strategy. And that is the government setting out its stall, saying this is how we want to go ahead and operate, and this is how we want to tackle this problem. And then absolutely nothing at all is done. You know, everyone gets really excited and they're like, great. They're saying recognise trauma. They're saying sort of that, you know, under 6 months, women are better off being, you know, given a community sentence. But of course, I was going to say, of course, if people aren't understanding also the gender piece and why women end up in prison, most of them are there, of course, because of domestic violence. Well, you can't give a woman a community sentence and a tag to her own home and a curfew into her own home if her abuser lives in the house. And most women in prison, you know, their abuser is the person to whom they say, I love you. That is not the same for men. That's why it doesn't work for women. You know, and often women have the pimp, the gang lord, the drug dealer, you know, they're drug mules. So usually their crimes are perpetuated by a man, and that's not an anti-man thing at all. You know, but when you look at men in prison, there's not usually a female pimp. There's not usually a female gang member controlling their movements and sort of involved in their crime. So when I was advising the government on this, this is what we were all saying. This isn't about being preferential to women over men. This is about being differential, and actually this is about being sensible and looking at the data and what we know and acting accordingly.
Edwina, do you think there's a perception that women shouldn't commit crimes, if you like, you know, because I say this because I was brought up in the area of Manchester where Ian Brady and Myra Hindley lived, and I actually, Myra Hindley was in my class at school, and I don't remember.
Who was in your class?
Myra Hindley.
Oh, Myra Hindley was in your class. For those of you who can't hear, yeah, he's talking about Ian Brady and Myra Hindley.
So she was in my class at school, but I don't recall her because I didn't go to school a lot anyway. People tell me that she was absolutely nondescript in that sense, you know, and that had she married a policeman or met a policeman, you know, she'd be, and I spoke to lots of people, and yet, you know, and I followed their imprisonment and the publicity, but I always got the feeling that she was more hated than him. And I've heard the same in Gloucester about Fred West and Rose West. I'm not, of course, I'm not, you know, condoning, you know, anything, but is there not this perception that women shouldn't do this?
Yeah, I think so. You know,
I mean, commit crimes.
Yeah.
Men do, you know.
I think, you know, the gender stereotypes are sort of alive and well. You know, we might be slightly better at trying to hide it. And yes, things are sort of moving on. But, you know, I sort of reflect. So I've just taken my children to their first football match, and it was the Lionesses at Wembley. And I actually got a bit emotional because I wouldn't have taken them to go to a sort of a male match. It was because it was the Lionesses. It was because it was at Wembley. And it was amazing. There were loads of children there, loads more women, lots of men too. But I sort of thought, gosh, it's weird, isn't it? You know, the first statue of a woman's gone up in Parliament Square. You know, people thought that women couldn't play football or no one would come and watch. And look, we're at Wembley, and there was over 77,000 people there watching. You know, the first female Met Commissioner, the first female bishop, and I sort of then went, oh, actually, you know, that's not so cool. It's great that it's happened. So I think, yes, and I think a lot of those views are, unfortunately, really held quite strongly when you get to the sort of hierarchy of the court system. And I only say that because it's been said to me over and over and over again, Edwina, we don't lock women up anymore for non-payment of TV licenses. And Edwina, we don't do this and we don't do that. And even after I've said I've worked in prisons for 20 years, it's not like I've just sort of heard it somewhere and I'm parroting off what other people have said. It's like, I literally know these people. And you just sort of stand there and what are you meant to do when an old judge sort of says, doesn't happen? It's like, oh my God, I don't have an answer for that. So yes, I think those stereotypes, unfortunately, are still alive and well. Anyone else? Yes.
I was just wondering about your work at One Small Thing and trauma-informed training for prison officers. mothers, when they're imprisoned, they have a huge sense of loss of that identity and role of motherhood, and coupled with guilt, a huge amount of guilt as well for being imprisoned mother.
Yeah.
Come into the prison office training that you're doing?
Not specifically, because we deal with trauma in the sort of broad brush sense. So whether that's rape, witnessing a murder, sexual abuse, all the sort of jolly stuff. But yes, of course, separation from family sort of comes into that. But it's really teaching the officers that, if you're a male officer working in a female prison, you are dealing with women who have usually been suffered very high levels of sexual violence. So the very fact that you're a man could be problematic. It's not your fault, but maybe think twice before you sort of crash through their cell door and they're lying on their bed. That could be kind of triggering if they've been raped all their life in their bedroom. If they're from a domestic violent background, the fact that you have male officers marching around shouting, Medline, lunch, it's crash, it's bang, it's sort of wallop. And if you've grown up in that sort of chaotic, violent household, that's not good. And, and a lot of the male officers go, oh my God, I feel really bad. I had no idea. And it's like, no, it's okay. You just sort of need to know this. And equally, if you're a woman working in a male prison, understanding how manipulative some of these men can be, making sure that, you don't sort of give away your personal details and all these things that are so different. But no, in answer to your question, not mothering specifically, of course, if it came up and the trauma of the removal, then yes. And we have interventions that we put in for women into prisons and men. They're peer-led. So it's the female prisoners, 2 facilitators. And when we first, I saw all this work happening in America and brought it over from America into the UK system, well, the English system, because we only have women's prisons in England. There isn't one in Wales, and Scotland's slightly separate. But yeah, they were like, no, you cannot let prisoners co-facilitate and be peer leaders with a psychological intervention. I was like, oh, that's weird, because it's happening in like 52 states in America, and there's loads of research to say it's fine, but there's always a fear from the staff that this is a really bad idea. So I said, how about we try it, and if the world explodes, then we'll know that it's a really bad idea, but, let's give it a go. I said, I've got a reputation to protect too. I don't want the prison service to do anything that's dangerous, and I would never want to do anything dangerous inside a prison, but I think you'll find it's going to be okay. Anyway, that was 5 years ago, and we've now got 11 of the 12 women's prisons allowing these interventions to run. And we now work across the 17 long-term high-secure male prisons, and one prison, Dovegate, has just started the male intervention with 2 peer facilitators. So even though it can all seem sort of quite depressing, still, where those good pockets of officers are, where those good governors are, you can really start sort of sowing the seeds of good. Yes?
Thank you so much for your speech. It's been incredibly interesting.
Thank you.
So obviously the UK has a lot to learn in terms of protecting women and families in prison. I was just wondering if there are any international systems that we could learn from particularly?
Yeah, there always is. I've been to prisons in Hawaii and South Africa and Norway and all over America. And you'll always find sort of pockets of good practice in lots of strange places. Even the prison that I went to in South Africa, where sort of men were literally lying on top of each other. Strangely, there was an amazing sort of program going on there. But yeah, I hate to be always to be the one to be like, yes, well, Norway. But Norway, I went to Halden prison, which is a big, sort of very expensive prison that they built. And they've got all sorts of good things going on there. And people say, could we have a Halden in England? And you sort of think, well, we've got different socio-economic things going on. We've got different cultural things going on. But they had houses for conjugal visits. They didn't allow tattoos to be on show because they saw tattoos as being sort of very inflammatory, especially with the gangs. They didn't allow men to sit in front of the mirrors and pump iron because they were like, muscles are weapons. That's just stupid to allow men to just sort of beef up so they can intimidate other men. So there were lots of things that we could have brought back to our system, but for some reason we just don't. But yes, there's probably not time to sort of describe the sort of family things that I've seen all over the world. But yes, and whenever I travel, I try and get into a prison. And I know. And my husband's a historian, and he always likes to get to a battleground. And I like to go to a prison. So if you ever meet us in a bar on holiday, we're like really fun to hang out with. We've got loads of jolly stories to tell. I think bang on 7:30. So I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for coming to listen.
Want to change anything? Thank you so much, Edwina. Normally, I do prepare something, and I thought I've done this so many times. I have the privilege of coming up here at the end of a lecture or a panel discussion, and it's a lovely opportunity for me, instead of every day solving prisoners' problems or asking funders for money, get to say thank you to fantastic people that allow us to do, I don't see any point in being modest, fantastic work. In for a pound, that's us. But I've been terribly moved. I didn't expect to be, because I work at the Prisoners Advice Service. I am a mother. I do know that my 8-year-old, if he doesn't see me for more than 24 hours, or if we're 10 minutes late picking him up, he thinks that something's really wrong. So a lot of what I want to say has slightly gone out of my head, and that wasn't what I expected. I don't generally like doing women prisoners casework, because it is itself, I think there's a lot of secondary trauma involved in dealing with women who have a multitude of complex, emotional, frankly traumatic issues that the prison system just simply isn't designed to deal with in the way that it deals far more efficiently with male prisoners. So I have found myself far more moved by this than I would have liked to have been. So huge thanks to Edwina again. It's a real pleasure, privilege for us that you've been able to deliver this for us. It was my idea as well to ask her, so I'm really proud of myself. Nice to see some of our regular funders, and what's really special about some of them is the understanding that they have, even those that aren't lawyers, barristers, solicitors, who understand the importance of sustaining PAS to deliver core services, where we can't always run projects, where we can't always sell something to a funder that's new or exciting, but the bog standard advice line, the bog standard outreach, the thousands of letters from prisoners who want answers to complicated questions in their life, the core work that we do day in, day out, that's not very romantic, that's really stressful, but 99% I think is the positive feedback on average we get back from prisoners, from the smallest thing that we do for them to the more complicated things, irrespective of the outcome that we are able to achieve for them. So a really big special thank you to our funders and supporters who understand what we do and why we do it, and say to us, go ahead, we're here, you do what you need to do. So thank you very much to, and I think you know who you are. Clearly our PAS has staff that once they get to PAS, they just sort of don't really leave. They're there for years and years and years. And that's because I think PAS is a good place to work. Most colleagues, I have to exclude myself here, of course, most colleagues are great people to work with, and we really we feel the work that we do is important and it's worthwhile, and it's worth the stress, it's worth the long hours, it's worth the secondary trauma almost that you deal with day in, day out, where you think, like Edwina said, nothing can shock me. Surely nothing can shock me. Surely I've heard it all after 5 years, 10 years, and you never do. We have an amazing body of supporters and volunteers who I've calculated earlier on this year. I think they make up about a sixth of our capacity, which is an extra. I'm not that good at maths. Our accountant is here, isn't she? But I think that's quite a lot. If we had to translate that into staffing costs, we wouldn't be able to fundraise for that, would we? We'd need another 2 fundraisers, wouldn't we? So thank you to all those volunteers, our in-kind supporters. They really are really important to us. I do want to, because I get to just say thank you to people, we do have a board of trustees now. We might be coming up to breaking the record and having more trustees than staff, which sounds not great, but then I'm quite a pessimistic person, and I thought the other day, no, that's because there are all these people who are prepared to give up their time as volunteers, who think, yes, I'll go to 4, 5, 6 meetings, I'll spend hundreds of hours a year free, giving up my time for free, committed to this, the governance, the cause that this organisation is working for. And that's a huge compliment to us rather than like a bloated body of governance type people. So thank you to all our trustees. And then the best thing about the whole evening, two things. Before you go and start drinking, I have to, because our fundraiser isn't going to stand here and say, can you give us money? I was going to go through the exercise and say to everybody, pull out your mobile phones, text prisoner, followed by 3, 5, 10, 15 or 20 to this number. And if you can do that, you'll be allowed to have a drink. We've really advanced in recent years and finally got ourselves a, what's it called? iZettle card contactless thing. So now nobody uses cash anymore. We used to have buckets and sometimes we were like, oh my God, we've got £20. But those days are gone. And so Jeff is going to stand by the door. If you want to leave the venue, you have to, you have to tap a contactless card to get out. But if you don't do either of those things, that's actually still okay. You can still have a drink, you can still mingle, and you can think about what Edwina has talked about this evening. Thank you so much to everyone for making this a nice evening.